All right, today we're going to talk about the red, green, and blue primaries and the secret color matrix. And this is a really cool tool to develop some really interesting palettes very quickly. And it's something that's not very well understood. So once you understand this, you will literally know more than probably 99% of people using Lightroom. So we're going to look at how they work, why and when to use these primaries, and I'm going to show you a couple of my favorite recipes and uses for them. All right, so this is something that's probably the least documented, least understood setting in Lightroom. Even the Lightroom manual kind of flubs the answer and I think gets it wrong. They basically say that moving the primary hue sliders is just a way to move the color wheel, and that moving the slider to the left is like a counterclockwise move on the color wheel, and moving to the right is similar to a clockwise move. And this isn't exactly true. Just to show you what I mean by this, let me just pop in here and show you an example in Lightroom. So here we have the camera calibration, and I'm going to show you what happens to this color checker when I move the red primary. So as I move it to the right, as I move it towards the section that looks kind of orange, it does in fact appear that we're going, at least for the red color, we're going to the right. We're going in a clockwise motion around the color wheel, and the red has become more orange. But if I do that again, watch some other things that happen that are pretty interesting. So if you just watch the green, if we're moving to the right along the color wheel, you would expect the green to become more blue. And so as I do this, we actually see a little bit of the opposite. The green actually becomes a little bit less blue. It becomes a little bit more yellow. And there's also some other weird things going on. If you watch the magenta as I do this, as I move this to the right, instead of just seeing the hue shift of magenta, it looks like we're just desaturating magenta. So all these kind of weird, interesting things are going on as I do this, and it just gets weirder as I start to move some of these other primaries around, and you can end up with some really weird, bizarre, some bizarre things that you just wouldn't think would be possible if all this was doing was moving hues around the color wheel. So what's going on here? Why is it that the hues aren't moving in the same direction? Why is it that this is changing saturation and luminance of some colors and not just changing the hue? Well, the answer lies in what's actually happening here. So drum roll, what's happening is this is actually changing the interaction between the primary color sensors on your camera. So if you remember when we talked about how a picture becomes a digital image, as light is coming into your camera lens, it's meeting a filter, and that filter is splitting the light into red, green, and blue, and it's putting it in specific places on the camera sensor so that it knows, okay, this sensor right here should be receiving green light, this sensor right here should be receiving blue light, etc. Well, what happens is that it doesn't happen exactly like this. There is some overlap, there's some spillage of light, there are, depending upon the camera model and depending upon the filter, maybe it's a little bit weak on the amount of red light that it lets in, and it lets in a little bit too much green light. There's all these different things that could be making it so that this isn't really just a one-for-one scenario. And the way that this gets corrected internally in a DCP file, in a camera calibration file, is the color matrix, right? And so you've got 9 rows, and or it's basically a grid with 9 different sections. And this one right here is basically saying, here's the relationship between blue and blue, here's the relationship between blue and green, and here's the relationship between blue and red. And so the positive numbers indicate a positive relationship. So obviously between blue and blue, there's going to be a stronger relationship than there is between, say, blue and red. And in fact, there's a negative relationship here. So this is just correcting for the way that your camera sensors work. Rather than having to get into all this, Adobe has gratefully given us this this ability to do something similar, to control a similar thing, but doing it with a slider. And so as we move these sliders, we're changing the relationships, and these numbers are actually changing. All right, so let's talk about this. So if we just break this down, if we look at the red primary hue and we look at the slider, if we move the slider to the right, what we're doing is we're increasing the interaction between the red and the green sensor. So let's just see what this looks like. So this is the color wheel before, and this is the color wheel after we've moved the slider to the right. And what we've done is we've created we've moved both red and green towards yellow. If you look at this red, it's lost some of its kind of magenta, and now it's really kind of an orange red. And yellow is a much bigger section, and the green is a little bit more of a chartreuse green, or the chartreuse green is a little bit more prominent, all centering in around yellow, because this is saying, hey, there should be a stronger relationship between red and green on a sensor level, and because of that overlap now, we end up seeing yellow. The other thing that we see is that we see a decrease in magenta and cyan. The reason for this is that if we're saying red and green interact more, well, we're also saying that red and blue and green and blue interact less. And since they're interacting less, there isn't as much red that's needed with the blue to create magenta, or as much green that's needed with the blue to create cyan. If that doesn't make sense, maybe go back to this section when we talk about color theory and the HSL panel a little bit more. So if we move this to the left, we're just doing essentially the opposite. We're increasing the interaction between blue and red, and so we see red become more magenta and blue become a little bit more purple and magenta. And conversely, we're seeing yellow decreasing, and we're seeing cyan decrease. Now, something a little bit different happens when we move the green primary slider to the right. It's almost as if we're doing the opposite of moving the red primary slider to the right. And so what we see is we see red becoming more magenta, and we see green becoming more blue, with a decrease in yellow. And so if we were actually to go back to Lightroom, we would see that in a lot of ways, these two will offset each other. So if I move red to the right and I move green to the right, we end up with something that's actually not that far from where we began. The red's a little bit different, but it's actually balanced out a lot of the other stuff. And so moving green to the right here is essentially the opposite of moving red to the right. If we move green to the left, we're increasing the interaction between the green and the red sensor. So this is actually very similar to moving the red sensor to the right. We also see cyan and magenta going down. All right, and as we look at blue, as we move blue to the right, we're increasing the interaction between the blue and red sensor. So no surprise, we're seeing red and blue converge on magenta, and we're seeing cyan and yellow all but disappear. And as we move this to the left, we're increasing the interaction between the blue and the green sensor. So when we do this one is actually a little bit different. In this case, we actually do see something similar to all the colors going the same direction around the color wheel. There is some clustering, so there's kind of a clustering of azure and of rose and of chartreuse, but we do see everything kind of going around with an emphasis on cyan. Looking at all those hue changes is a lot. If we're going to simplify this in a minute, so you don't have to necessarily remember all that. I've just never seen it explained right, so I thought you may be interested to know. All right, so saturation is much simpler. When we look at saturation with the primary sliders, it's just a very wide, very broad saturation. So the red saturation is saturating obviously mostly in the areas that are most red, but that saturation really extends to anything that there is red in. So all the way to purple, starting to get into blue. With green saturation, it's the same, centers around green, but gets all the way up into orange and all the way up into cyan. And with blue, obviously centered around blue, but it gets all the way up into red and all the way up into kind of a spring green. The interesting thing with the saturation with the primary sliders is that it always seems to emphasize smooth transitions. So if you were to take the blue saturation and just really crank it up, you would actually see it start to go even into the red, even into the yellow. It would essentially affect the entire color wheel. It would just affect the blue areas more so. So this is actually a really good, the blue saturation is actually a great way to add some vividness to your image. It'll actually increase the overall saturation of the image very nicely without affecting too much of the skin tones. All right, so this is so complicated. Why would we use this? Well, there's actually a couple of really good reasons. The first is that the limitations of this are actually pretty similar to some of the limitations of film emulsion. With film emulsion, remember, you only have those three colors of light, right? You've got a blue emulsion layer, a green emulsion layer, and a red emulsion layer with filter layers in between. And so film manufacturers, they really could only affect the three primary colors. And so if they wanted skin tones that looked a certain way and they changed the red channel, well, that would also change everything that had red in it, all the way to all the yellows and all the purples. So the limitation actually makes this pretty similar to what we could accomplish with film. It also is something that can simplify the color palette. Remember when we were talking about building a color palette, we talked about this idea of honing in on specific hues and then decreasing hues that could be taken away from what we want our focus to be. And remember, when we move the red primary slider to the right, we're actually accomplishing all of those things. We may not it may not be the right thing. It may not be what we want to end up with, but it will actually focus in on a hue, in this case yellow, and decrease magenta and cyan. And so if we can find the right palettes, this is actually a really good way to develop our own color palettes. It also makes it a lot faster if you know what you're doing. So this is on the right, this is my attempt to emulate this palette on the left that I got with the primary sliders. And it's pretty close. It's not quite perfect, but you can see I had to impact hue, saturation, and luminance and had to make a lot of different changes. So if we can just use the primary sliders, hey, we could save all this work and end up with potentially a better result. And just on that, on the result, with the primary sliders, there's a limited amount of things we can do, but in some ways that helps us. That helps us get smoother results. So this is on the right again, my attempt at emulating this color palette. And you can see that there's actually some pretty harsh breaks in here. You can see that there's kind of this weird band of rose red that's weirdly saturated compared to the bands next to it. You can see that there's not a very smooth transition over here between green and yellow versus over here it looks much smoother. You can see that the transition between the blue and cyan is not as smooth, or between blue and purple. And so we end up when we use the HSL tools, just as a result of the way that those bands are set together, it's set up to give you control. It's not necessarily set up to keep you from doing things that could hurt the image and could hurt the quality of it. And so with this limited control of the primary sliders, we actually can get smoother results. All right, so let's talk about a couple of my favorite settings. The first is, we'll call this kind of a classic film portrait setting. And we've got the red primary up to +25, the green primary hue up to +35, and the blue primary hue down to -15. And this is what results from that. We end up from the red primary pushing up, we end up with our red tones being a little bit more orange, a little bit more golden, a little bit more singular. If you look at before, in this section we have all the way from kind of magenta and rose and red and orange and yellow, and now this just feels a lot smoother. It's a lot more of a singular tone, singular color. We also have this really nice desaturated light blue green. We have a very again, a very singular, more azure blue and soft magenta and purple colors. So if you look at a before and after, this is just with Adobe Standard, and then this is with the with that applied. So again, if I go kind of back and forth, if you watch the skin tones, this is before, this is after. It's a little bit more golden and glowing. This is before. Watch the purple in a shirt. This is before. This is after. The purple's a little bit softer, and then the blue, the hue has changed and it appears to be a little bit more saturated. So the hue is a little bit more of an azure hue as opposed to a navy. Okay, so the next setting I'm going to show you is something I've calibrated to be pretty close to AppleRaw. Now, AppleRaw is what is used inside things like the Finder. So when you see a preview of a raw photo in your Finder window, that's using AppleRaw. When you take a photo on your iPhone and it gets converted, that's converted to an AppleRaw standard. If you've ever used iPhoto or Aperture, that uses AppleRaw. So it's a pretty prominent standard, and something that I think is sorely lacking from Lightroom. But this is my attempt. This gets us pretty close to AppleRaw, and the settings are: red primary hue goes up +5, saturation goes up +8, saturation is +5, the green primary is up just a tiny bit, +3, saturation is up +5, the blue primary shifts a little bit towards navy, so it's +5, and the saturation on blue really goes up to +15. I'll have these for download, so don't feel like you have to make these yourself. So this is before and after, and the biggest change here is you've got more vivid colors, particularly in the blues. The reds are just a touch warmer, just a smidge, and the greens are just a touch cooler. So if we look at a before and after, this is before, this is just Adobe Standard, and then this is Adobe Standard with my settings to calibrate it towards AppleRaw. So before and after, the biggest difference you can see is obviously in the saturation of the blues and the purple. There's maybe a little bit of difference with the skin tone. It's maybe a tiny bit warmer. The greens are also a tiny bit more saturated, but the biggest difference is with the blues. All right, so I'll leave you with one more, and this is a classic landscape film. One thing that was very common for landscape films to do was to have the shadows tinted towards magenta, just because that tended to give a little bit more of a feeling of saturation, even if it wasn't there. The red primary, in this case, the hues are actually a little bit cooler for the reds, and this leads to a more intense red, and the saturation is way up. We leave the hue the same for green, put up the saturation a little bit, and for blue, we really bump up the saturation to +50 and move the hue just a little bit to the right, a little bit towards navy. And you can see this has drastically increased the vividness in the blues, and we've got much more intense reds with magenta. So this isn't great for skin tones because you end up with really harsh magenta skin tones. But to be fair, landscape film also wasn't very good for skin tone. So there's a little bit of a trade-off here. So here's before, and here's after. So just a big increase in vividness, some change in the hue, but the biggest change obviously is coming from the increase in the saturation in the blue channel. A few tips for you if you plan on using this in the future. The first is to make sure that you make your changes here before you change HSL or color tables. The reason for that is because these are some pretty drastic changes, so you want to get your big changes in before you start making your smaller, more specific changes. The second tip is to make changes to the primaries in Lightroom and not in the D&G profile editor. We'll talk about this later, but inside the D&G profile editor, you'll see this same tool, the same primaries tool. Don't use it in there because it's broken. And finally, as you build these, it's almost like you're building a cocktail, right? Where you've got ratios. It's 2 parts of this ingredient and 1 part of this ingredient, maybe half a part of another ingredient. So if you wanted to say increase the effect of something, let's say that we had this at 25, 35, minus 15. Let's say that we wanted to intensify this, or we like the direction of this and we just wanted to increase it. Well, you'd want to keep these at the same ratio because these all are so relative to each other. So we could make this, if we really wanted to push it, we could make this 50, make this 70, and make this minus 30. And we've just intensified in the same direction that we've already gone. So think of it in terms of the ratios between these 3 components because they are so interdependent. All right, well, that's it for the red, green, and blue primaries. If you have any questions, just leave it in the comments.